The Lakota chief's wife lay dying in childbirth. A fleeing slave saved her and gained a sister. The knife was the last thing she had given me. That seems like the right place to start, though I didn't know it was a start at the time. When you're running, nothing feels like a start. Everything feels like a continuation of the same long problem. The knife was hers, Mama's, a bone-handled thing, white as old teeth, with a crack running halfway up the handle that she'd wrapped in strip of leather to keep it from splitting clean through. She pressed it into my hand the night I left the Albemarle County farm, her hand covering mine for a moment like she was trying to push something through the skin itself, something beyond the knife. She didn't say anything. Mama was past words by then. Past most things. What she had left was the knife and one long look, and I took both of them north with me. That was 4 years before the November I'm telling you about. 4 years of working when I could, hiding when I couldn't, moving always up and west where men like me had at least a chance of being anonymous if not invisible. Missouri, Iowa, Dakota Territory by the summer of '67. I was 42 years old, built like a fence post, lean and knobbed and harder to knock down than I looked. And I'd been a free man for exactly as long as I'd been running, which meant I'd never really been free at all. I had a name the farm had given me that I'd stopped using, and a name I'd given myself, Elias Cobb. Elias because a preacher on a flatboat in Missouri had read me the story of Elijah in the wilderness, and I liked the sound of it enough to take the near neighbor of it. Cobb because I found a dry corn cob in my coat pocket the morning I crossed into Iowa, and it seemed as good a reason as any. Names on the run are like tools, you take what's at hand. What I had besides the name and the knife was a fair skill with horses, a working knowledge of how to set a splint and pack a wound with clean moss, and a particular quiet that some men read as surly and others, if they were smart, read for what it was. The absolute focused attention of a man who had learned, over 42 years, that survival is mostly about listening. I was in the Cheyenne River country when the first snow hit. Not a dusting, a real snow, the kind that comes off the northern plains without apology, no clouds building up first, just a flat gray lid slamming down on the afternoon and then the white. I had a single blanket, a shirt, and a canvas coat that had been decent in September. I had 3 strips of dried venison and about a cup of dried corn. I had the knife. I was 3 days' walk from anything I could call shelter. There was a trading post near the river that I'd been told would take a man in for labor, and I'd been moving fast enough that I hadn't been paying the sky the attention I should have. I found the ravine by accident, or the ravine found me. I went down a slope sideways on slick grass and slid most of the way to the bottom before I caught a root and stopped myself. When I got my wind back and looked around, I was in a cut in the earth maybe 20 feet deep, choked with cottonwood and elder. The wind died straight down. It wasn't warm, but it was 60 degrees better than the exposed hillside. I pulled dead wood and made a lean-to against the ravine wall. Took me about an hour in the failing light, and I had a small fire going by dark. Not much of a fire. Enough. I ate 1 strip of venison and half the corn and sat with my back against the clay wall and listened to the snow make its sound in the cottonwood branches above. A soft hissing, almost like breathing. It was close to midnight when I heard the horse. I knew it was a horse before I heard it fully. There's a particular creak of snow under a shod hoof and a different one under an unshod hoof, and this was unshod, and there were 2 of them, and they were moving too slow and too careful for riders who weren't in trouble. I put the fire out. Not completely. I banked it deep under the wood, kept it alive but blind, and I moved to the ravine wall and got myself small in the shadow of the biggest cottonwood and put my hand on Mama's knife and waited. 2 horses came down into the ravine 20 feet to my left. There was a man on the first one, big, wearing a buffalo robe, moving with the controlled stillness of a man who was angry or scared or both, and holding them together by main force of will. On the second horse was a woman, lying forward against the horse's neck, her arms wrapped around it. A rope ran between the two horses' necks, slack enough that the man had some play. He was leading her horse without looking like he was leading it, letting the horse follow on its own sense. They were Lakota. I knew that much: the robes, the cut of the horses, the way the man held himself, even bent with worry. I'd been in the territory long enough to know the difference between nations by then, not the language but the way of carrying. He saw my banked fire before he saw me. He pulled up and his hand went to his belt, and I said, quiet, not loud, the way you talk to a horse you don't want to spook. I'm no threat to you. I've got a fire. He looked at me for a long time. The woman on the second horse made a sound. It wasn't a pain sound exactly, more like a sound you make when pain is so constant it's become the weather you live in. The man said something in Lakota that I couldn't follow, but I know the word for fire, peta, because it's one of the first useful ones you learn, and I heard it. I uncovered the fire. He got down from his horse in one movement, a big man, a head taller than me, with a face that would have been still water if the water hadn't been about to boil, and he went to the woman and spoke to her low. She lifted her head. In the firelight I could see she was young, maybe 25, and she was in labor and something had gone wrong. You could see it in the way she was holding her body. Not the held tight of early labor, but the slack and frightened looseness of a body that has been at it too long, and is starting to wonder if it can finish. I'd seen that before. Not childbirth, though I'd seen that too, plenty, in the quarters where women labored without help and sometimes without coming through it, but that particular look, the giving way look, you see it in men with fever, men who have bled too long. The moment when the body starts to have a conversation with itself about stopping. I said, how long? He looked at me. He didn't speak English well, I'd find that out later, but he spoke some, the way most men in the territory who dealt with traders at all spoke some, and he understood enough. He held up his fingers. 2 days. 2 days in labor and moving. I didn't ask why they were moving. That was a question for another time. I said, I know something about this. Will you let me try? He looked at me for a long time. I didn't move, didn't shift, just let him look. A man has to take the measure of another man, and you can't hurry it and you can't help it along with words. You just stand there and let him see what there is to see. What there was to see was an older black man, lean and weathered, alone in a ravine in a snowstorm, with a banked fire and a bone-handled knife and eyes that had nothing to hide because hiding anything had stopped being useful about 4 years back when you stripped everything down to the bone of yourself just to survive. He said a word. One word, how, yes. Her name was Winyan Waste Win. That's what he called her. It means good woman, I'd learned that later, and I'd think, yes, I knew that from the first minute before I knew the words. His name was Mato Sint, Bear Tail, and he was the chief of a band of Hung Papa Lakota that had been wintering 50 miles north, which was where they'd been heading when she went into crisis. They'd gotten separated from the rest of the band 3 days back in early snow, and he'd made the decision to keep moving toward the winter camp rather than stop in the open, and now here they were. I won't tell you all of what happened in that ravine over the next 6 hours, because some of it isn't mine to tell, and some of it is just hard to put into words without making it sound like something other than what it was, which was 2 people working at the edge of what was possible with what they had. What I had was Mama's knife, a clean shirt I tore into strips, the knowledge that the child was turned wrong. I found that out in the first 10 minutes, and the memory of watching an old woman named Hetty, who had been the quarters midwife on the Albemarle farm, turn 3 babies in my 20 years there. I'd watched her because watching was the only education available to me, and I watched everything. I hadn't known I was storing it. You don't know what you're storing until you need it. Mato Sint held his wife through most of it. He didn't look away. I told him in pieces, in broken sentences, pointing and showing, what I needed him to do, and he did it, And I'll tell you, there are not many men who could have done what he did in those hours. Held his wife through her screaming, talked to her in his own language steady and low, never once let the fear on his face become the thing in the room. The child came at around 4 in the morning. She came face up, which is hard, and she came gray and still. And for a moment that I will not describe further, I thought we had done everything right and it had not been enough. Then I did what Hetty had done. I rubbed that child's back hard and fast with both hands, like you're trying to start a fire, because sometimes what a body needs is just to be reminded sharply that it's here, that it has arrived, that the world expects it to participate. The child made a sound like a door hinge. Then she cried, really cried. The sound of it went up out of the ravine into the snowstorm, and I imagine it went all the way up. Winyan Waste Wind made a sound I have no word for. Not relief, not joy, more like something returning. Like a sound a house makes when the people come home and the fire gets lit. Mado Sint pressed his face against his wife's hair and stayed there a long time. I sat back against the clay wall and looked at my hands. They were shaking. I hadn't noticed them shaking during the work. They waited until the work was over to shake, which is how hands are. After a while Mado Sint looked over at me. His eyes were wet. He said nothing. Men like him, men who carry that kind of dignity, they don't make it cheap with words when the weight of a thing is still in the room. He just looked at me and I looked back, and that was enough. I made up the fire and boiled snow for water and they rested. I sat up. Somebody had to keep the fire, and it was their night to rest and my night to watch, and that seemed right to me. The snow stopped around dawn. When the light came gray and flat down into the ravine, Winyan Waste Wind was awake, the child at her breast, and she looked at me across the fire with dark, clear eyes. She said something I didn't understand. Mado Sint, coming awake beside her, said, "She asks your name." I told her, Elias Cobb. She tried it, Elias, close enough. She said something else. Mado Sint said, "She asks where is your family." I looked at the fire, "Don't have one." He translated. She listened. She spoke again, longer this time, and he listened, and when she was done there was a pause before he translated, like he was working out how to carry it. She says, he stopped. She says a man who brought her child into the world in the cold with nothing but his hands, this man is not without family. She says you are her brother. She says this is not. He paused again. Not a thing she is offering. It is a thing she is telling you. It is already true. I heard that. I heard every word of it. And I will tell you that I had been cold for 4 years. Not the cold of November, the other kind. The cold of being a man without a place in the world, without anyone who knew your name and used it like it belonged to you. And those words hit me the way heat hits you when you come in out of that cold. Not all at once. Not soft and gradual, but sudden and almost painful, like your face waking up. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Tell her I hear her." He did. She nodded once. That was that. We stayed in the ravine that day. She was in no condition to ride, and the snow was deep enough that travel was foolish anyway. I hunted in the late morning, got lucky with a rabbit, and we ate. The child slept and woke and slept. Mado Sint and I sat across the fire in the afternoon, and he told me slowly, in pieces of English and gestures and the few Lakota words I'd picked up, why they'd been moving alone. A disagreement with a band of younger warriors who wanted to ride against a nearby settlement, Mado Sint's refusal, his decision to take his wife and move toward the winter camp of his uncle's band, rather than be part of what he knew would end in disaster. He'd been willing to be thought a coward by the young men. He wasn't a coward. He just knew the difference between courage and stupidity, which is a distinction that costs most men about 30 years to learn. He had a quality I've only known in a handful of men in my life. He was completely without performance. He didn't tell the story of what he'd done in a way that made him look good. He just told it. We talked for about 3 hours. He taught me 10 words of Lakota. I taught him 10 words of English, mostly useful ones: fire, water, come, stop, danger, good. By the end of it, we understood each other better than a lot of men understand each other after a year. The next morning was clear and bright and cold, and we broke camp and traveled 2 days north to the winter camp. I walked at first, leading the pack horse, Winyan Waste Wind's horse carrying her and the child, and by the first afternoon Mato Sint had me riding the pack horse and taking the lead. It didn't feel like being led. It felt like traveling with someone. The winter camp was 80 lodges spread along a bend in the river under cottonwood and ash, the smoke rising straight up in the cold air in 20 separate columns. We came in from the south, and people came out to meet us, first a few, then more, then a crowd, and there was a period of considerable noise and movement as the band learned that their chief had returned with his wife and a living child, and a black man none of them had ever seen. The child was named that evening. The ceremony is theirs, not mine to explain in full. What I can tell you is that Winyan Waste Wind, lying in the robes in the lodge with the child on her chest, reached out and put her hand on my wrist at the moment they spoke the child's name, and she held it there like she was including me in the circle of the thing. I was included. Mato Sint in the days that followed made plain to his people what I had done and what Winyan Waste Wind had declared. He did it the way a chief does things, no ceremony, no announcement, just the steady fact of it made visible. I was given a lodge. I was given a place at the fire. When the men went to councils, I was not sent away. I was not spoken to as a curiosity or a guest. I was spoken to as a man who lived there. This was new. I want to say that plainly because I don't want to dress it up. I was 42 years old, and I had never in my life been simply accepted as a man who belonged where he was. There had always been a condition, a master's permission, a white man's nod, the sufferance of people who could revoke it. Here there was no condition. Winyan Waste Wind had declared it, and Mato Sint had made it real, and the band had absorbed it the way water absorbs a stone dropped into it, completely, without remainder. I learned the language over that winter. Not all of it. Lakota is not a language you pick up like a sack and carry away, but enough. Enough to talk, to joke, to understand what was said around a fire. Enough to be a person rather than a presence. I worked, that's the other thing. I had always worked and I didn't know how to stop. I was useful with horses. Mato Sint had 40 horses and they were fine animals and I knew them all by name inside of a month. And I was useful with the practical problems of winter camp. A broken wheel on a trade cart, a tent pole snapped by a wind, the leg of a horse that needed cleaning and packing, a child with a chest sickness I'd seen before and knew how to steam. I didn't offer these things. I just did them when I saw them, and people noticed and word got around in the way word always gets around in a small community. An old man named Wambly Ska, White Eagle, who was the band's healer and who had initially looked at me with a careful, assessing skepticism that I respected, came to me in my lodge one afternoon in January and sat down without asking and drank my coffee. I had coffee, a luxury, something I'd traded for at the river post before the snow, and after a while he said in careful English, "You know medicine?" I said, "Some." He said, "You know where you learned it?" I said, "From watching and from need." He thought about that. "That is how I learned also." He drank his coffee. "There is a woman with a bad leg I have not been able to help. Come with me tomorrow." That was it. That was the whole conversation. The next morning I went with him and looked at the leg and we talked about it, and between us, we worked out a treatment. And it worked. And after that Wambly Ska and I spent part of most days together. And he taught me things I've never seen written anywhere, and I've never told anyone who would have written them down. I think about Mama's knife a lot in that period. I had it still, kept it in my coat always, and sometimes I'd take it out and look at it, the bone handle white as old teeth with the leather wrapping, the crack Mama had wrapped to keep it from splitting. She'd given it to me as a tool for running, for survival, for the kind of use you don't want to think too hard about. It had turned out to be a midwife's instrument. I thought she'd have found that funny in a dry way. Mama had that kind of humor. The world is mostly not what you think it's going to be. You might as well find that funny. Winyan waist when healed well. The child, a girl, named something I won't try to render here, a name that means something like new light after a hard winter, which will tell you what kind of people they were, grew and thrived, and was a fat happy baby by February. Winyan waist wind brought her to me most mornings on the way to get water and held her out for me to hold, which I did badly at first, then better, the way you learn anything, through doing. The child would look at me with that absolute blank-faced seriousness of babies, and I would look back at her, and we would take each other's measure. One morning in late February, sitting outside my lodge in a brief warm sun with the child asleep against my chest, Winyan waist wind sat beside me and we were quiet for a while. Her English was coming, the way mine was coming in Lakota, slowly in the best words first, the necessary ones. She said, "Before, in the ravine, you were running." "Yes." "To where?" I thought about it. I didn't know, away from something I didn't have aware. She was quiet, the child shifted and resettled. She said, "Now you have aware." That is not a question I will try to answer for you. It landed on me the way things land when they are simply true, not like a surprise, like a recognition. I said yes. I stayed through that winter and the following spring, and then the summer, and then the winter again, and somewhere in the second winter I stopped measuring time in terms of how long I'd been there, and started measuring it the way you measure time when you belong somewhere. In seasons, in events, in the small daily markings of a life. I went back to the trading post at the river twice, for supplies, for news of the larger world. The larger world was not going well for Motto Since people. I knew that. Anyone who was paying attention knew that. The treaty violations and the encroachment of the gold seekers into the Black Hills were already underway, and the men I talked to at the post spoke of what was coming with the cheerful certainty of men who expected to profit from it, and the particular blindness of men who cannot imagine that a thing they want to do might also be wrong. I told Motto Sint what I heard, all of it. He already knew most of it. He was a man who paid close attention to the world he lived in. What he didn't know, what I could give him from my own years of surviving inside a world that wanted to own me, was the particular way powerful men convince themselves of the rightness of what they're taking. I'd learned that from the inside. It turned out to be useful information. He listened. He said, "What would you do?" I said, "I would keep what I have, protect who I love, and be very careful about the ground I choose to stand on." He thought about that for a long time. Then he said, "That is what I am doing." The third winter. I'm going to tell you about one night in the third winter, because it is the night I think about most when I think about that time. A late blizzard March, the worst kind, wet and heavy and mean, the kind that breaks branches and kills livestock and makes even the most experienced men in the territory sit down and wait it out. We were in Motto Sint's lodge, 8 of us, the kind of close-backed winter evening I'd come to know well, the fire small and efficient in the center, the smoke finding the hole at the top, the warmth pressing in on all sides, the sound of the wind outside like a second conversation happening in another language. Winyan waist wind's daughter, she was 2.5 now, walking, opinionated, impossible to reason with, perfect, had decided at some point in the evening that my lap was the correct place to be, and had arranged herself there with the absolute assurance of a person who has no doubt about the rightness of her choices. I had one arm around her the way you do, the way it becomes automatic, and I was half listening to Motto Sint talking to Wambly Ska about some dispute between 2 families in the camp. Winyan waist wind was across the fire, doing something with sinew and a piece of hide, working by feel more than sight, the way you work when your hands know a task without being told. She looked up once and caught my eye across the fire, with the child asleep against my chest and the storm outside and the warmth in the lodge. She didn't smile. Lakota women of that generation, women of that character, didn't do things with their faces for effect. What she did was, She held my eye for a moment with a look that I can only describe as recognition, the look of a person seeing something and acknowledging that it is what it is. I held it back, same thing, this is what it is. Mato Sint, pausing in his conversation, glanced at me, one of those glances that carries a sentence in it. His sentence was something like, "You are here, you are ours, this is your fire as much as mine." Then he went back to talking. I sat there with the child and the warmth and Mama's knife in my coat pocket and the snow hammering at the lodge and thought, this is the life you did not know you were running toward. I've thought about how to tell this part many times. There's a temptation to make it bigger than it is, to talk about freedom, about what it means to belong, to draw the lesson out and hold it up for examination. I'm not going to do that. What I'll tell you is the plain fact. I was a man who had spent 42 years belonging to someone else and several years belonging to no one, and then I was a man who belonged somewhere. Not because I'd earned it in the way you earn a wage, not because someone had granted it. Because a young woman nearly killed in a ravine in a snowstorm had looked at me across a fire and told me it was already true. Mato Sint's people were moved in the end. Not that winter, not the next, but it came. I was with them when it started, and I rode with the band for a time, and then I stayed behind when it became clear that what was coming was a thing I couldn't protect them from, and that staying would cost them more than it cost me, and I knew how to read those calculations. I'd been reading them my whole life. I won't tell you the details of the end of that time. They are not mine to tell in full, and some of them are not fit to tell at all. What I'll tell you is this. The last morning I was in the camp, before the soldiers came with their maps and their orders, Winyan Waste Wind came to my lodge. It was early, the sky just paling. The child, not a child anymore, 6 years old, her own person entirely, was with her. Winyan Waste Wind stood in the lodge door for a moment, and then she stepped forward and put both her hands against my face, the way you cup a thing you want to keep. She looked at me a long time. Her eyes were clear and steady and not crying and not angry, just looking, seeing. She spoke in Lakota. Then she said it in English, slowly, making sure I had it. "You are my brother. That does not change where you go." I took hold of her wrists, her hands still on my face. I held them. The child pushed between us and held onto both of our coats with her fists the way children do, claiming both of you at once. I carry that. I've carried it a long time now, longer than I carried the running, longer than I carried the farm. The weight of it is different, not a burden, more like the weight of a full canteen. You feel it, but you're grateful because it means you're not thirsty. Mama's knife is in my coat still. The leather wrapping is gone. I replaced it twice. The second replacement is worn now too. The bone handle is yellower than it was. The crack is still there, running halfway up. I've kept it sharp enough to still do work. I am an old man now, older than 42 by a distance I don't always like to count. I live in a particular place I won't say the name of, with my particular days, my particular fire. There are men here who know my name and use it like it belongs to me. Some nights the wind comes off the north and hits the side of the house and it sounds, just for a moment, like snow in cottonwood branches. When it does, I put my hand in my coat pocket and feel the knife. And I think, Elias. And I think you have a where.